about sometimes for practical purposes, like medicine or change of therapy and so on. Money. So this conversational tool is an example of, on the one hand, a quite cognitive approach because it just deliberately, explicitly addresses topics with icons saying you can talk about this and you can talk about this and this. But there's one more embodied aspect about it which I wanted to show, which I like, is that people sit on both sides of this thing, and the design, the visual design of this thing, and what you do with it is physically getting closer to one another, because you start on your own side putting objects here of topics that you want to talk about. It's like a little game of, it's like a negotiation game about what is on the agenda today to talk about. And then you gradually move your objects further to the center until you agree together here in the center. What is a topic that we both feel is important and relevant and we want to address, right? So you make here use of the physical space between people and of physically approaching one another and coming together in the center, which I liked. Hannah de Jager says um, you can have this small scale participatory sense making about little things. So, for example, one example that she gives is when you walk in a narrow corridor in a street and you meet somebody else, and especially now with Corona, this is extra relevant. You make this little dance together of who goes on which side, right? So that's participatory sense making in a very concrete, moment to moment setting about something relatively simple. Who walks where, right? So you make sense of that together in interaction. But she extends that to much more complex cases, and she mentions things like collaborating in a joint research project, reaching an agreement after group negotiation. But these examples are hard to unpack, she says. And that is because, of course, if you are a scientist about it, you want to break down such complex situations of three people having a business meeting in all the small details of all the aspects of such a situation, which is very difficult. But for designers and design researchers, we don't have to completely unpack such examples. We can just design for them. We can just start to design a tool that would help the communication in that setting and find out about important parts of the participatory sense making through designing potential tools for it. And so this is what I like about design research, that psychologists would want to try and first cut up this whole situation here in all the component parts, so to speak. But in one sense, maybe there is no component parts, right? So it all hangs together in a very complex network of interactions. So if you design an object in the middle that starts to do something there, you have a sort of intervention into the practice that helps you understand the practice without having to break it down in all little modules, right? And that is, it makes it less precise, but more complete and holistic in a way. And I think in that sense, design research and building tools and then reflecting on them together with the people that you're designing for is a method that could complement more traditional laboratory research in the psychology lab. And we've been doing that. And I want to show you a movie of study that we did designing an interactive floor that would help in creative group sessions. So it would help participants in a brainstorm meeting to understand each other and to understand the problem as a joint sense-making activity. Um, and I will show the movie now. And later on, we designed a whole more high fidelity prototype, working with parts of it were really working and parts of it were faked using a Wizard of Oz setup, but the participants did not know it didn't work. So you could actually show and open and change the location of the pictures with your feet. And we looked at many sessions of people, three people interacting with each other, and we looked at how they used these pictures. And what I specifically focused on not was whether they were able to come up with a good design solution or something. They got a design. It was like a brainstorm assignment for to design something for an amusement park. But it doesn't really matter what they were talking about. I only looked at how they were interacting with each other. And I made a lot of sketches showing where people were pointing, standing, looking. So all the non-verbal, mostly the non-verbal interactions in relation to their verbal, what they actually said. So for example, to give one example, I made lots of these sketches. One example here is that these two women were talking with one another and they were pointing at the picture that she has here. And this was the topic of the conversation. And then she at some point looks while talking with this person about this picture, she looks at the other guy who was not really involved at a certain moment. And then the next step, what happens is that he sees that as a sort of invitation to say something, right? So they are look, and then she also turns her body towards him. So he is now suddenly being looked at. So he has an invitation to speak. And first of all, he sort of acknowledges that he's part of their conversation by pointing at a picture that is all the way here. It's a picture that's part of her circle. And he says, "Oh, I like that picture." By the way, the pictures on the floor were sort of ideas they first generated individually. So they brought a set of ideas and thoughts to the floor and then discuss with each other. So he sort of says like, "Oh, I like that idea over there. It looks a little bit like what I have over here." And then he points to his own idea. So he joins the conversation by sort of connecting to something of the girl here and then brings the attention of the whole group to his own circle here. And then he enlarges that picture because that's what you can do with your feet. Two girls right now look at that picture, and now the two girls start to point at that picture, and she here on the front also starts to address it and say stuff about it. So this is a nice example of how the flow of the conversation moves from one item to another item, and how the three people sort of connect with each other by pointing at and doing things with the external artifacts, right? So the external artifacts are not only to represent information, they also help to coordinate the conversation between people and to manage, for example, something like turn taking. When do I speak? When do you speak? And how do we bring the different things together? Now, later on, we had a big project in Eindhoven, a whole PhD project by Filimon Jasma, who sort of worked further on these ideas by making all kinds of interactive tables that people could stand around, and using the tangible objects here, they sort of have the same function. So by putting an object here, you introduce an conversation element to the discussion, and then you can point at it and you can say, "Oh, I think it's very important," then you put it in the middle, or "I don't think it's important," so you put it on the side, and so on. And then there were also, what you were doing here was projected here on big screens, so people could also look at what the whole group was doing. And well, it's too much to go into now in detail, but this was really an attempt to bring participatory sense making to the practice, in this case of people in the city talking with government officials about new policies and how to develop the neighborhood and so on. And finally, we used the same principles also in a more critical provocative design assignment by Leonore Allen, who was a master project again, who worked with high school pupils, young adults, talking about how they see themselves and their own identity, and what the role of social media in it is. And one thing that she made was a prototype of a system where all your social media information would also be projected around you, literally on the floor as you would walk into the school. So if you would walk around in this modern new high-tech school, you would immediately see who has many followers, who has no followers, who is popular, who is friends with whom, and so on. And of course, this was a provocative design, because you could imagine all kinds of terrible things happening if people could see that. But also it made the students think reflectively by seeing this prototype about, oh, this is actually what we're already doing, but we're doing it online. And so now it feels like as if it's not it's still, you can see that it still would matter if you just put that information there physically around your body as you walk in the school. It would still be different than if it's on the screen, right? So, and um, I can't give any ultimate conclusions to what how to make sense of this, but in any case, it is very provocative thing to think about. Okay, we put all this information about ourselves on social media, and it hangs around us as a kind of circle around us. So when I see somebody online, I immediately see how many followers, what did they post, who are they connected with, and this I take with me intuitively in judging this person and making sense of that person. Um, uh, and we're not conscious of that so much, right? We're not really, we forget that a little bit. But if it would be on the floor while walking through the halls of the school, whoa, what to think of that, right? So I think that was a very interesting and nice study. Now, and finally, the third thing that I wanted to show as a kind of design example. So we've seen the examples of how you can be in touch with each other, and we've seen some examples of how we may facilitate large group sessions and how people make sense together in groups. I now want to focus more on how people make sense together who have very different working brains, so to speak. And the prime example here, which is my main focus of research at the moment, is autism. So if you are autistic, you could say your brain really works different from if you are not autistic. And we may call this neurodiversity. So it means that there's all different, there's different kinds of brains, right? You could have an attention deficit disorder brain or an autistic brain, and there's maybe other types as well. And then you could have a brain that we would normally call normal. But of course, what is normal, right? The neurodiversity perspective says, well, most people have these brains that we call normal brains, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the right sort of brain or the best possible brain or the correct brain, and that everything else is necessarily disorderly or wrong or bad or should be fixed, right? And I like this perspective, not to deny that autism is not, and at least sometimes a very severe condition which causes lots of problems for people in everyday life, right? You run up against a lot of challenges because the world as it is organized today is not organized for autistic people, right? So you go, something as simple as buying bread in a supermarket can be very challenging if there's loud music and many people there. um, and and maybe sometimes that's not even necessary. Why is there loud music in the supermarket, right? It could be that uh, I could imagine a store that would be really autism friendly, but yeah, autistic people are just a minority, so they don't get acknowledged a lot in the design of our environment. right? And it's an open question to me at this moment whether autism would really be a very strong disorder if the outside world would be a different kind of world. And you could look in history maybe saying, okay, I don't know, if you would be working at a farm in medieval times, attending the horses and being out in the fields all day in nature with the trees and the birds, would you be so autistic in the negative sense as an autistic person as that you would be when you live now in a heavy traffic, noisy city, having to go to the office with a stupid boss who is bossing you around and not understanding you and so on, right? So it can be that a lot of the problems that you get from autism are not necessarily due to the autistic brain per se, but to the interaction between the autistic brain and the outside world, which is not designed very autism friendly at the moment. Now, I'm not judging that at all at the moment. I'm very open to all kinds of interpretations here. There are many autistic people who say, no, it's really a disability that I have. I have a disorder that I have to live with. There's also many autistic people who say, well, no, well, I'm okay with myself, but uh, it's just it's the it's the outside world that has a problem. And then there's all kinds of shades of gray in between. Um, my point is more that um, what I think would be an interesting way to look at interactive technologies is to think about how. Um, so, so one question that I had turning into this topic was how can we design interactive technologies that would help autistic and non-autistic people to interact with each other in a way that is more like a participatory sense making rather than that the autistic person necessarily has to adapt and learn something that the non-autistic person somehow already knows or is capable of, right? So we could see autism purely as a disability, which makes the non-autistic person the standard, right? I'm not autistic, so what I'm doing is correct. And then if you're autistic, you need to learn how to do it as I'm doing it. Actually, that's what we see if you look at autism technology today. This is what we see. There's a lot of uh, uh, technology that is meant to help autistic people, mainly focused on children, and mainly focused on learning children certain skills that they don't seem to have because they're autistic, but they should have them because it's part of what we think is the normal way of dealing with things. So this is a robot, and the tweet says here, this is from a website, it says the robot was designed to help children with autism learn to interact with humans. So that was even more. This was I really needed to make a screenshot of this because it implicitly says that children with autism are themselves not real humans and they I don't know. It's really crazy title. But what we wrote a paper with various people who were interested in working with in the field of autism, saying that most existing assistive technologies for what we call neurodivergent individuals are designed from a fixing things perspective. That is to regulate behaviors of people and train them to understand and follow the same social norms as everyone else, right? And instead, what we wanted to focus on was what we call diversity computing, which is can we use sensors, actuators, digital processing, feedback, and so on, all the technological tools that we have to make sure that an autistic person and non-autistic person or any other person in their interaction are equally empowered and free and able to express themselves and to start to tune in to each other and start to feel each other's interactions in the way that participatory sense making describes when people really make that dance together, right? So if you think about it again as a kind of dance, we want autistic people and non-autistic people to dance together in a way that is is agreeable for both. So it works for both, even though they both may have very different intuitions and natural inclinations for what a good dance should be, right? So there's no longer a sort of external norm to say, oh, this is the right way to dance. These are the rules for dancing. It would be dancing together. Well, you both have very different backgrounds of how to dance, and then maybe what would it be for a ballet, classical trained ballet dancer to dance together with a hip hop street artist, right? I think it's possible, and actually examples literally of this have been shown in art that it is possible, and that people still, if they both like to dance, they will still at the end find each other and connect, right? And we wanted to see if we can design technologies that would help people connect, even if they're very different from each other. Now, we did a small study looking at there's a big project at the University of Twente revolving around this robot here, Zeno. And it's very interesting work and a lot of technical work also on it, how the robot can express emotions. But what you see is that before you know it, the emotions that this robot is expressing are sort of communicating, and you see it here also on the picture already, happy, sad, and then with the face. So this is the normal non-autistic way of showing emotions, right? You show it in the face and you show it in a certain way. And what many therapies are focused on is training the child, the autistic child, to learn to recognize non-autistic way of emotional expression. But maybe autistic people have just a very different way of expressing emotions, and also different way of recognizing or tuning in to other people's emotions than looking at the face. For example, looking at the face can be very frightening for people with autism, and the reasons for that may not be completely clear, but we could just sort of accept that. What we also saw in this study is that in experiments with a child and a therapist and Zeno, the child actually wanted to do very different things with the robot. It wanted to pick up the robot, touch it, hold it, and so on. So it had a sort of natural way of trying to make sense of the robot, right? But the child was not allowed to do that because the focus was just on looking from a distance at the face and interpreting the face as a kind of symbol of being happy, being sad, and so on, right? So there's all kinds of assumptions in how this whole study was set up that explain that determine what the rules are, the social rules for how the child should interact with the robot and with the therapist and so on. And these were all based not on autistic ways of sense making, but on the standard, normal, non-autistic way of sense making. We did see all kinds of interactions between the child and the therapist and the robot that were part of what you could call attempts at participatory sense making, but very often the official rules of the game, the experiment, so to speak, would intervene in that, would go against that. So, for example, the child not being allowed to just grab and pick the robot and play with it as a doll, which was the affordance of the robot, at least for that child, right? And the child was not allowed to explore the world in a way that was natural to the child. Now, if you see autism as one of many diverse ways of sense making, um, you start to realize that the whole world that we live in is actually organized in a way that is focused, that is really, it fits the ways of sense making of non-autistic people, but it doesn't fit the more natural ways of sense making for autistic people, right? So the world is organized largely by and for non-autistics. And a lot of problems in autism actually comes from a hypersensitivity to sounds and light. And our world just has too much of that, especially the designed world with lamps and flashes and music and noise that is all around, right? And so maybe we could design worlds that are more neutral to that, or at least more autism friendly. These pictures are from a nice movie by Miguel Giron that shows how sensory overload can work if you are autistic. Now, one person who goes against this sort of medical disability model of autism, that takes the non-autistic person as the golden standard, so to speak, is Damien Milton. He's a sociologist from the University of Kent, and he is also himself autistic. And he has done a lot of research, and he developed a theory called the double empathy problem. And this theory says that if you think that not being autistic is the standard, right? So that's the healthy, normal, ideal way of how human beings should interact with other human beings and with the world at large. Then you may start to think that autism has a problem. So if you're autistic, you have a problem and you need to understand normal people, right? And then you get all these theories that were the official theories for a long time, that it's still in the official diagnosis manual, that if you're autistic, that means that you have trouble in social interaction with others and in understanding other people. Now, um, Damien says, well, that may be true in some way, but the reverse is also true. Non-autistic people also have trouble understanding autistic people. And it's actually a double empathy problem. It's the problem that if you have a very differently wired brain, it may just be inherently difficult for you to understand somebody who is just very different from you, right? So if there's a big difference in the basic way in which you see and perceive and interact with the world, then it's very difficult for you to empathize with the other person. So not empathize in the sense of feeling for the other person, but just being putting yourself in the shoes of the other becomes difficult, right? If you have very different tools, I mean, it's very difficult for me to really put myself in the shoes of a carpenter, because I don't have the skills and the tools that a carpenter has to deal with the environment. So the carpenter sees the world completely different from the way I do. So that already, I mean, regardless of autism, that's already difficult, right? Now, suppose you are autistic, and another person is not autistic, you could see it as you have just very different skills, very different tools to interact with the world. So quite naturally, you don't easily understand one another, right? And if you want to get closer to one another, you need to see this as a two-way street problem, right? Of two differently skilled and able people that don't that have a hard time understanding how the other person is using their tools. So what kind of interactive artifact, and this is the question that I actually want to end this lecture with, because I'm thinking about that right now, and this would be an excellent paper topic. So what kind of interactive artifact would actually help an autistic and non-autistic person to be together and make sense together and feel each other, and how could they together explore something and connect and interact and be closer together in a way, right? Um, I think that that would lead, if you ask the question in this way, it would lead to very different kinds of technologies than this robot that is trying to train the child to behave as if he were non-autistic, right? To adapt to the non-autistic norms and standards of social interaction. What if you just put an object in between two people and say, I'm not judging any of you. I just want to help make the flow of the dance between you two better. So I'm very interested in that question, and I would encourage everyone to try and find that out through designing for it.